The moment Cyrus Brenner rode into the town of Hallow Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, with a collection notice folded in his breast pocket and a loaded Colt revolver on his hip, he told himself this job would be no different from any other ride-in, take what was owed, and ride back before sundown. He was wrong about every single part of that. Hallow Creek sat in the scrublands of West Texas like something God had started and then abandoned halfway through, a place of dust and dry wind and buildings that leaned against each other for support. The main street was wide enough to turn a wagon around in, lined on both sides with the usual assortment of a saloon, a general store, a livery, a post office, and a handful of weatherboard homes that had seen better decades. A water tower stood at the north end of the street, painted with the town's name in letters that had been sun-faded to nearly nothing. Two old men sat outside the barber's shop, watching Cyrus ride past with the particular kind of slow attention that came from having nothing else to do. Cyrus was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair that curled slightly at the temples where the sweat had gotten to it, and a jaw that had not seen a razor in 4 days. He wore a plain brown duster and a gray hat that had been beaten into submission by enough miles, and enough weather that it sat on his head like it had been born there. He was not a lawman, though people sometimes assumed so. He worked for a man named Gerald Fitch out of San Antonio, a lender of money who preferred to describe himself as a financial patron, and who sent men like Cyrus out into the territories when his patrons fell behind. The debt in question was $420, borrowed by a man named Thomas Bristol some 2 years prior for the purpose of buying seed stock and a second team of horses for his farm outside Hallow Creek. Thomas Bristol had made 3 payments of $50 each and then died of a fever the previous October, leaving behind a modest farm, a mule named Jasper, 6 acres of cotton that had barely survived the winter, and 1 daughter. The daughter was 24 years old. Her name was Mabel Bristol, and as far as Gerald Fitch was concerned, the debt had passed to her along with everything else Thomas Bristol had left behind. Cyrus tied his horse, a reliable bay gelding named Drum, to the post outside the Hallow Creek saloon and went inside for a drink and to ask directions. The saloon was dim and smelled of sawdust and old whiskey. The bartender was a short man with a waxed mustache who introduced himself as Percy. "I'm looking for the Bristol farm," Cyrus said, setting down his glass. "Thomas Bristol's place. I understand his daughter is managing it now." Percy looked at him with an expression that could not quite decide between wariness and something that resembled pity. "Mabel Bristol," he said. "That's right. What business you got out there?" "Financial business," Cyrus said, which was the phrase Gerald Fitch insisted upon. Percy refilled his glass without being asked, which Cyrus took as a gesture of sympathy rather than hospitality. "She's a hard worker, that girl," Percy said. "Took over the whole place after her daddy passed. Been out there every morning before sunrise, far as I've heard. Can't say I agree with whatever financial business you're bringing to her door." "I don't ask for agreements," Cyrus said. "No," Percy said. "I expect you don't." The Bristol farm was 2 miles east of town, down a road that was more suggestion than road, rutted and pale with dry earth. Cyrus rode Drum at an easy pace, watching the landscape settle into the particular still heat of a West Texas afternoon. The cotton fields were thin and scattered. A fenced line of cedar posts ran along the road, and a few longhorn cattle stood in a back pasture, looking at him with the wide, blank eyes of animals that have decided curiosity is not worth the effort. He saw her before he reached the gate. She was in the side field, wearing a canvas work apron over a plain brown dress, her dark hair pinned up but with several strands come loose and falling against her neck. She was hammering a fence post into the dry ground with the kind of determined, rhythmic effort that told him she had been at it for some time, and intended to continue regardless of whatever came next. The post went halfway into the earth and refused further entry, and she pulled the hammer back and hit it again with a crack that sent a pair of sparrows spiraling up from a nearby hackberry tree. She did not look up when Cyrus rode to the gate, dismounted, and latched drum to the post. "Miss Bristol," he said. She hit the post again. The post dropped another inch. "Miss Bristol," he said again, louder. She straightened, pushed the loose hair from her face with the back of her wrist, and looked at him across the distance of 30 yards with dark brown eyes that were neither afraid nor particularly welcoming. She was not a soft-looking woman, not in the way women were described in parlor novels. She was lean and sun-browned, with strong hands and a steady expression, the kind of face that had been shaped as much by weather and work as by anything she'd been born with. She was also, Cyrus noticed despite himself, uncommonly striking. "Who are you?" she called. "Name's Cyrus Brenner. I work for Gerald Fitch out of San Antonio." The name landed on her like a stone dropped into water. The steadiness in her expression did not crack, but something behind it shifted. She set the hammer down against the fence post and walked toward him, pulling off her work gloves and tucking them into the apron pocket. When she reached the gate, she looked at him directly, and he had the peculiar sensation of being measured and found to be about what was expected, which was not entirely a comfortable feeling. "You're here about the debt," she said. "I am. $420. Less the $150 your father paid. $270. $270, she repeated, and said it the way people say an amount of money that is technically a specific number but functions in their lives as something closer to an impossibility. "That's correct," Cyrus said. "Come inside," Mabel said. "I'll put on coffee." He had not expected that. He had expected argument or tears or the kind of brittle defiance that people adopted when they were scared but too proud to show it. He had not expected an invitation to coffee delivered with the same tone a woman might use to invite a neighbor to discuss a fence dispute. The farmhouse was small and clean and smelled of wood smoke and something baked. The main room served as sitting room, kitchen, and dining space, with a cast iron stove along the east wall and a table with 4 chairs in the center. The walls were bare except for a framed photograph of a man Cyrus assumed was Thomas Bristol, who looked stern and tired in the way that men look when photographs are being taken. There was a braided rug on the floor and curtains on the windows made from flour sacking that had been bleached and embroidered around the edges with small blue flowers. Someone had worked to make this place feel like home. He suspected that someone was her. Mabel poured water from a clay pitcher into the coffee pot and set it on the stove. She washed her hands in the basin and dried them and sat down across from him at the table with the same directness she had shown in the field. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at him. "I don't have $270, she said. "I understand that," Cyrus said. "I have $43 saved. The cotton crop last year was poor. This year looks better, but it won't be ready until fall. I have the cattle, but I can't sell them all and keep the farm running." "Miss Bristol, let me finish," she said, not unkindly but firmly. "My father borrowed that money in good faith and paid what he could before he got sick. I'm not arguing the debt is invalid. I'm telling you the circumstances, because I expect whoever hired you would like to know the circumstances before deciding what to do next." Cyrus looked at her for a moment. Gerald Fitch was not a man who spent a great deal of time considering circumstances. Gerald Fitch considered numbers. "Mr. Fitch has been patient for 2 years, Cyrus said, which was true in the same way that a snake in the grass is patient. "I know he has," she said, "and I'm grateful for the patience. But I'm asking for more of it, 6 months, until the cotton comes in. I'll have enough then to pay a significant portion and we can arrange payments for the rest." 6 months is a long time. "It is," she said. "But it's less time than my father was sick, and less time than it took him to build this place, and considerably less time than the rest of my life, which is what I'll spend working to pay off this debt whether you give me the 6 months or not." The coffee pot began to sound. She got up and poured 2 cups and set one in front of him. It was strong and black and considerably better than anything he had drunk in the last 2 weeks on the road. "I'll need to send word to Mr. Fitch," Cyrus said finally. "That's fine," she said. "I can write out my proposal if you'd like something official to send." "You can write?" She looked at him over the rim of her cup. "Yes, Mr. Brenner, I can write. My mother taught me. She taught me arithmetic too, so I'm quite clear on how much I owe and what the interest amounts to." He felt a heat come into his face that was not from the coffee. "I apologize," he said. "I didn't mean it as an insult." "No," she said, with something that was almost amusement. "I don't suppose you did." Cyrus sent the telegraph to Gerald Fitch from the post office in Hallow Creek that evening. The response came back by noon the next day and was characteristically blunt. Either collect in full or secure collateral against further delay. If neither is possible, proceed with lien on the property. A lien on the property. That was the polite phrase for what it meant, which was that Gerald Fitch would put his name on the deed to the Bristol farm and Mabel Bristol would have nothing. Cyrus held the telegraph paper for a long time, standing in the doorway of the post office with the Texas sun coming down hard on the crown of his gray hat. He tried to approach the situation the way he always did, as a transaction requiring resolution, as a set of numbers and a procedure. He had collected 12 debts in the past year and a half. He had presented liens on 2 properties. He had done it cleanly and without allowing himself to think too hard about what he was doing, because Gerald Fitch paid him $30 per collection, and that kept drum and feed, and kept Cyrus himself in food and a roof when the work was sparse. But there was something about this one that sat differently. He rode back out to the farm the next morning with the telegraph response in his pocket and a feeling of discomfort that he did not know what to do with. Mabel was in the cotton field when he arrived, which was becoming a reliable fact about her, the way that certain things about certain people become reliable facts quickly, without your intending to note them. She came to meet him at the gate again, reading his expression with those steady dark eyes. "It's not good news," she said. "No. Tell me exactly." He told her exactly. She listened without interrupting, which was another thing about her he had noticed, that she listened the way people should listen but very rarely did, with her full attention and without preparing her response while he was still speaking. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the cotton field, and the dry leaves of the hackberry tree near the fence rustled together. "If he puts a lien on this property," she said carefully, "how long do I have before it's enforced?" 30 days, typically. Maybe 60, depending on how quickly it goes through the county. And if I could secure the money another way, if I had all of it or most of it within that time, then the lien would be lifted. "All right," she said. She didn't cry, she didn't collapse. She nodded slowly, as if she were running calculations in her mind the way you might run calculations on paper. "I need to think about this. Will you be staying in town?" "For now," he said. "Good," she said. "Come for supper tonight." "I mean that genuinely, not as social obligation. I have something I want to discuss, and I'd rather do it properly over a meal, not standing in a field." He was surprised again. "All right," he said. He arrived at 6 with his hat in his hand, and a small jar of honey he had bought at the general store, which was the only thing that seemed appropriate to bring, and which he felt slightly foolish about. Mabel accepted it without commentary, which he appreciated, and set it on the table beside the pot of beans and the pan of cornbread she had made. They ate in the kind of comfortable silence that is unusual between strangers, the kind that normally takes time to develop. Outside the window, the sky was going through its extravagant West Texas sunset, all orange and copper and deep purple, and the light came through the flower-sacking curtains and made everything in the room look warmer than it was. "I have a plan," Mabel said, after she had poured him a second cup of coffee. "I'm listening. There is a livestock auction in Comanche Springs in 3 weeks. I've been thinking about it for a while. My neighbor, Jim Alders, has 8 horses he'd like to sell, but he's too old to make the trip, and he's offered me a 10% commission if I broker the sale for him. I have 4 cattle I can sell outright. Between the commission and the cattle plus my savings, I calculate I can get to roughly $180. That's still 90 short. I know, she said, but I have a letter from a man in Abilene, a farmer named Colt Watkins, who's been wanting to buy the timber rights to the back 40 of this property. He wrote 6 months ago and I turned him down because I didn't want to give up anything. But the timber rights are not the same as the land itself. The land stays mine. He offered $100 for the rights. Cyrus set down his cup. That gets you to 280. More than enough, she said. He looked at her across the table and felt something he could not immediately put a name to, something adjacent to admiration but more complicated, more personal. She had done the arithmetic faster than he had, and done it better, and had produced a solution in less than 24 hours when men twice her age, and with twice her resources would have spent a week complaining about the unfairness of the situation. "There's a problem," he said. "The trip to Comanche Springs. It's 4 days there and 4 days back if the roads are clear. It's rough country between here and there. And the letter from Watkins in Abilene will need a written response with the agreed terms before anything is settled." "I can write the letter to Watkins tonight," she said. "It will take 2 weeks to get a response. That's fine. The trip to Comanche Springs is the harder part. I can't go alone." "No," he said, "you can't." There was a silence. The oil lamp on the table burned steadily between them. "Jim Alders can't make the trip," Mabel said. "He's got a bad hip and his eyesight is going. Percy at the saloon has a wife and 2 children, and can't leave for 2 weeks. The men I might otherwise ask are either unavailable or not men I would trust with 8 horses worth several $100s. "Miss Bristol," Cyrus said slowly. "I'm asking you," she said. "I am asking you to come with me to Comanche Springs. You'll be compensated. I can offer you $10 from my savings now, and another 10 when we return, which is fair pay for 2 weeks' work." "I work for Gerald Fitch," Cyrus said. "Yes," she said. "And Gerald Fitch wants his money, which he will get if you help me earn it. This is in his interest as much as mine. A bird in the hand, Mr. Brenner." He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back at him without flinching. "I'll send another telegraph to Fitch in the morning," he said. "Thank you," she said. Gerald Fitch's response to the second telegraph was, to Cyrus's mild surprise, a grudging agreement. Fitch was a businessman, and Mabel's plan, as Cyrus laid it out in the wire, was the kind of thing a businessman could appreciate even if he resented having to wait for it. Fitch gave them 3 weeks and reminded Cyrus that his own payment depended on collection, which was his way of saying hurry up and don't get distracted. They left Hallow Creek on a Tuesday morning in late April, Mabel driving Jim Alders's horse wagon with 8 horses tied in a line behind it, and Cyrus riding drum alongside. The air was still cool from the night and smelled of sage and damp clay. The sky was enormous and pale blue, the kind of sky that West Texas specializes in, the kind that makes you feel simultaneously very small and very much alive. Mabel had packed provisions with the same practical competence she apparently brought to everything. There was dried beef and biscuits and dried apricots, a pot and a pan, coffee and a bag of ground cornmeal, 2 blankets, a water barrel on the back of the wagon, and a Winchester rifle she handled with the comfortable ease of someone who had grown up with one. "Where did you learn to shoot?" Cyrus asked, watching her check the rifle before they set out. "My father taught me," she said. "He said a woman alone on a farm in West Texas had 2 choices, learn to shoot or learn to worry. He said worrying was a waste of time." He sounds like he was a sensible man. Something softened briefly in her expression, like a window shade lifted an inch to let in light and then lowered again. "He was," she said. "He was also stubborn and proud, and he hated asking for help, which is why he borrowed from Fitch instead of selling a parcel of the land outright when he needed money. But he was a good man. He worked himself to death trying to give me something worth having." "I'm sorry," Cyrus said. She looked at him sideways. "Are you?" "I am," he said. She considered this for a moment and then clicked her tongue at the horses, and the wagon rolled forward onto the road, and that was that. The first day was easy going. The land was scrubland and mesquite, broken by occasional dry creek beds and limestone outcroppings, and the road they followed was well enough traveled that the wagon didn't labor too badly. They talked in the intermittent way of people who are not yet sure what they are to each other, but who find themselves wanting to talk nonetheless. He learned that she was 24, that she had been born in the farmhouse she now lived in, that her mother had died when she was 12 of a lung sickness, and that she had essentially run the household from that age while her father ran the farm. She had learned everything about both, the cooking and the canning and the sewing on one hand, and the planting schedules and the cattle management and the fence repair on the other. She learned that he was 31, that he had grown up in Missouri, that he had worked as a ranch hand for several years before a bad drought had pushed him off the land and into the kind of drifting work that eventually led him to Gerald Fitch's office. That he had a sister in Kansas City who he wrote to irregularly, that he had owned a dog named River who had died 2 years ago and whom he still missed with a specificity that surprised him when it surfaced. "What kind of dog?" Mabel asked. "Mixed breed, brown with one white ear. Found him half drowned in a creek when he was a pup, hence the name. He was not a smart dog. He was, however, a very good dog." Mabel smiled at that. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, and it changed her face in a way that he found himself thinking about for the rest of the afternoon, which was not something he allowed himself to examine too closely. They made camp that first night beside a dry creek bed, under a canopy of cottonwood trees that still had enough leaf to create the impression of shelter. Cyrus built the fire and Mabel made coffee and reheated the beans she had packed, and they ate and watched the fire and listened to the night settle around them. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead. How many people have you done this to, collected debts from?" He was quiet for a moment. 12, he said. 13 counting you, though yours isn't resolved yet. And how many of them couldn't pay? Most of them couldn't pay in full. A few couldn't pay at all. What happened to those ones? He looked into the fire. Liens were filed. In 2 cases, the property was eventually sold to satisfy the debt. Did that bother you? He considered lying or deflecting, which were both things he was reasonably good at. He looked at her across the fire instead and said, "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then why do you keep doing it?" "Because it pays," he said, "and because finding other work is not as simple as telling yourself you should." "No," she said, "I know it's not." She poked at the fire with a stick. The embers flared and settled. "I'm not judging you, Mr. Brenner. I just wanted to know who I was traveling with. And now you know." "I know a little more than I did," she said. "That's not the same as knowing. But it's a start." He lay awake for some time that night, listening to the horses and the distant sound of a coyote and the soft rhythm of Mabel's breathing from her bedroll on the other side of the fire. He was a man who had spent a great deal of time alone and had come to find it unremarkable, the way you come to find most things unremarkable once they become habitual. But lying awake listening to another person breathe across a campfire felt like the opposite of unremarkable. It felt like something he had not known he was missing. He was not a man given to sentimental thinking. He noticed this about himself and told himself to stop it. The second day brought harder going. The road narrowed and the scrubland gave way to rougher terrain, broken limestone and prickly pear and cedar breaks that the wagon had to be guided through carefully. By mid-afternoon, the wind had picked up from the south, carrying dust that got into everything, and the horses were fractious with it. It was Mabel who first spotted the trouble. A wheel on the wagon had been grinding since noon, and when she pulled up to examine it, they found that the iron rim had worked loose on the right rear wheel and the spokes were beginning to splay. "This is bad," Cyrus said, crouching beside it. "It's fixable," Mabel said, already digging in the wagon bed. She produced a hand mallet and a wedge of iron and a length of wire from the toolkit she had packed, which Cyrus had not even noticed was there. "Do you have everything in that wagon?" he asked. "I have everything we need," she said. "There's a difference." She handed him the mallet. "You hold the rim, I'll drive the wedge. Between the two of us we can keep it together long enough to reach Sanderson. There's a blacksmith there." They worked at it for an hour in the dust and the wind. It was not pleasant work. The rim was heavy, and the iron was hot from the sun, and the ground underneath them was uneven. But it held roughly, and they drove on toward Sanderson with Mabel watching the wheel and Cyrus trying not to watch Mabel, and both of them knowing they were in a race against the wheel's deterioration. They made Sanderson by late afternoon. The blacksmith, a heavy-set man named Ezra who wore leather over leather and said very little, looked at the wheel for a long time and then quoted them a repair price of $3. $2.50, Mabel said immediately. Ezra looked at her. The rim isn't ruined, she said. It needs reseating and a few new spokes. That's $2.50 worth of work and you know it. Ezra looked at Cyrus as if expecting him to override her. Cyrus said nothing. Ezra looked back at Mabel and said, $2.75. Done, Mabel said, and shook his hand before he could reconsider. They stayed in Sanderson that night at a boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Carraway who gave them separate rooms, and served a supper of roasted jackrabbit and sweet potatoes that was the best meal Cyrus had eaten in weeks. At the table there were two other boarders, a traveling salesman and a young minister, and the conversation moved around pleasantly, and Cyrus watched Mabel talk and laugh with a naturalness that surprised him, because in his experience people who worked as hard as she did often forgot how to be easy in company. She caught him watching her at one point and gave him a look that was mostly amusement and just slightly something else, something he could not read, and he looked away and concentrated on his sweet potato. The minister, a young fellow named Samuel who was perhaps 23 and earnest in the way only the very young can be without embarrassment, made a comment over dessert about the nature of obligation, something about how the debts we owe to one another are more than financial, and Cyrus watched Mabel's face for a reaction. She was quiet for a moment and then said, with a thoughtfulness that made the room go a little still, "That's true. But you still have to pay the financial ones, or someone else suffers for it." The minister nodded seriously. The salesman nodded less seriously. Cyrus did not nod at all. He was thinking about Gerald Fitch and about liens and about what obligation actually meant when you were the instrument of its enforcement. On the third day, after a morning's rest while the wheel was being properly repaired, they set out again in better spirits. The landscape had changed again, opening up into wide grassy flats interrupted by cedar ridges, and the air was clearer and cooler. The horses were calmer. The sky was a deep vivid blue, and hawk shadows moved across the pale grass below it. Mabel taught him a song she said her mother had taught her, a simple melody in Spanish that she didn't entirely understand the words of but had memorized phonetically as a child and never forgot. She sang it without self-consciousness, sitting up on the wagon bench with the reins easy in her hands, and her voice was not perfect, but it was warm and true, and Cyrus rode alongside listening and felt something that he could only describe as an ache, though it was not the unpleasant kind. "What's it about?" he asked when she finished. "Something about a river and someone waiting beside it," she said. "My mother said it was a love song, but she wouldn't explain more than that. She said love songs lose something when you explain them. She sounds like she was wise." "She was," Mabel said. "She died before I was old enough to appreciate it properly. That's the trouble with wisdom, I think. You usually recognize it too late." In the late afternoon of the third day, something happened that Cyrus had not been prepared for, though he should have been, given that they were crossing rough country with 8 horses and a wagon full of value. 3 men on horseback appeared on the road ahead of them, riding slowly, positioned to block the way. They were not wearing badges and their manner was not friendly. Cyrus said, very quietly, "Pull up." Mabel pulled up. She did not ask why, she had already seen them. "This a lot of horses for 2 people," said the man in the center, who had a red bandana around his neck and the kind of smile that is not the same thing as friendliness. He was looking at the horses and at Mabel with equal interest. "They're going to market," Cyrus said. "We're expected." "Expected by who?" "The auction house in Comanche Springs," Cyrus said. "The ledger is on record. The horses are registered under the Alders brand, which I'm sure you can verify." This was true and also a calculated statement, because men who intend to steal horses prefer that no one can verify them, and the suggestion of paperwork and registration was a way of making the math less appealing. "Maybe we should take a look at those papers," the man said, edging his horse forward. Mabel's Winchester came up across her lap in a motion so smooth and practiced that it barely looked like movement. She didn't raise it all the way. She just rested it there, unmistakably, the way a person rests their hand on something to indicate they know where it is and are comfortable with it. "The papers are in the box under the seat," she said pleasantly. "You're welcome to ride alongside and I'll show you, but I'll need you to keep your hands where I can see them." There was a long moment during which nobody moved. The wind stirred the dry grass beside the road. The three men on horseback looked at each other and at the Winchester and did the particular arithmetic that men in their profession do when they assess whether the value of what they want is worth the cost of getting it. "Ma'am," the man in the center said finally, touching his hat brim. Not friendly, not apologetic, but acknowledging the situation. They pulled their horses aside and let the wagon pass. Cyrus rode past them without looking back, which took some discipline. He could feel the back of his neck prickling for a good quarter-mile. When they were far enough down the road that the three men were out of sight around a bend, he exhaled slowly. "You've done that before," he said. "I've had occasion to," Mabel said. She had put the rifle back in its place under the seat, easy as replacing a book on a shelf. "People see a woman alone and they make assumptions. The rifle corrects the assumption." "You weren't scared," she glanced at him sideways. "Terrified," she said. "But scared doesn't mean stopped." He looked at her, really looked at her for a long moment. The late sun was behind her, turning the loose strands of her hair into copper wire, and she was watching the road ahead with that steady, forward-looking quality she had, and Cyrus thought, with the quiet force of something he should have seen coming but hadn't, "I am in a great deal of trouble." They reached Comanche Springs on the afternoon of the fourth day, road-weary and dusty, and satisfied in the way that people are satisfied when they have done a hard thing and done it right. Comanche Springs was a proper town, considerably larger than Hallow Creek, with a hotel and 2 banks and a main street that ran straight and purposeful for 6 blocks. The spring for which it was named still ran clean from the limestone shelf at the south edge of town, and cottonwood trees grew thick around it, providing the only real shade Cyrus had seen in 4 days. The auction house was a large open building at the north end of town, already bustling with buyers and sellers, and the general noise and smell of livestock brought together in one place. Cyrus handled drum while Mabel went to register the horses, and he watched her move through the crowd of ranchers and buyers and auction hands, most of them men, watched the way she spoke to them directly and was listened to, mostly because she knew what she was talking about and spoke about it without apology. Jim Alders's 8 horses sold on the second day of the auction for a total of $610, well above what either of them had anticipated. Mabel's 10% commission came to $61. Combined with the $43 from her savings and the $72 she got for her 4 cattle, she had $176 before the timber rights letter was even sent. They sat in the hotel's small dining room that evening over a meal that was considerably more refined than road cooking, and Mabel did the arithmetic on a piece of paper 3 times to make sure she had it right. "I still need the timber rights sale," she said. "But between this and that, I'll have more than enough." "You'll want to send the letter to Watkins from here," Cyrus said. "It'll reach Abilene faster than from Hallow Creek." "I wrote it this afternoon," she said, and slid a folded paper across the table. "Would you look it over? You've dealt with more of these transactions than I have." He read it. It was clear, precise, and legally reasonable. It covered the terms she wanted, the price, the boundaries of the timber rights, the exclusion of mineral rights, and the conditions under which the rights would revert to her if unused within 5 years. He had seen agreements drafted by lawyers that were less well constructed. "This is good," he said. "You sound surprised," she said with that almost amusement. "I'm surprised less and less," he said honestly. "That's an improvement." She looked at him for a moment across the table, The dining room was full around them, the clink of cutlery and the rise and fall of other conversations, but between them it felt quieter, more particular, like the space between them had a different quality than the rest of the room. "Tell me something," she said, "and be honest with me. I'll try. When you came to my farm that first day, what did you think of me?" He considered various versions of the truth. "I thought you were going to be angry," he said, and I thought you were going to cry," he said, "or plead. That's usually what happens." "Does it make the job harder?" she asked. "When people cry?" "Yes," he said. "Though I've gotten better at not letting it." "That sounds lonely," she said. He looked up at her sharply. She was not being cruel about it. She said it the way someone says a true thing about something they have observed, with a kind of quiet accuracy. "It is," he said, and was surprised to hear himself say it, because it was not something he had ever said aloud before to anyone. She looked at him steadily, and something in her expression was not pity and not comfort and not challenge, but some careful mixture of all three, and he felt it land somewhere in his chest in a place he was not sure he knew was there. "Well," she said, picking up her fork, "you're not alone right now." It was a simple thing to say. It was perhaps the simplest thing she could have said, and yet Cyrus sat with it for the rest of the meal and into the night afterward, sitting on the edge of the hotel bed in his boots and his duster, looking at nothing in particular, turning that sentence over and over in his mind the way you turn a stone to find its best side. "You are not alone right now." The trip back from Comanche Springs was different from the trip out, lighter in some physical sense. The wagon emptied of horses, and carrying nothing but their provisions and the weight of what had passed between them over the last several days. They talked more freely on the way back, with the ease of people who have shared difficult things and found themselves still standing on the other side. She told him about the farm in detail, the rhythm of the planting seasons and the particular character of the cotton, how it required patience and attention both, how there was a satisfaction in seeing the bolls open in late summer that was unlike any other satisfaction she knew. She told him about her father's ambitions for the land, his plan to expand the cattle operation, the dreams he had sketched out on winter evenings that had not come to pass. He told her about Missouri, about growing up on his father's small farm before it failed, about the years of ranch work in Kansas and Oklahoma, the cattle drives he had been part of, the country he had covered on horseback and on foot. He told her about the landscape he had loved best, which was high country, mountains to the north and west, the kind of landscape that Hallow Creek and its surrounds were not, and she listened and asked questions that showed she had been listening to everything he said. On the second night of the return journey, camped again under cottonwood trees beside a creek that actually had water in it this time, low and clear and running over pale rocks, he watched her from across the fire and thought about what he was doing. He was watching her the way a man watches a woman when he has stopped trying not to. He was paying attention to the way she sat, easy and unself-conscious, with her legs crossed and her coffee cup balanced on her knee. He was paying attention to the particular way her voice went when she was being dry and humorous, slightly lower, as if the joke was something she was sharing rather than performing. He was paying attention to her hands. She had strong hands, capable hands, hands that had driven a fence post and held a rifle and done arithmetic on a paper in a hotel dining room and been offered across a table to close a deal with a blacksmith. He was paying attention to her hands in the way that was different from noticing them, the way that was more like knowing them, and the fact that he was doing this was a problem he was not sure what to do with. She looked up from the fire and found him looking at her. He did not look away in time, she did not look away either. "What are you thinking?" she asked, direct as always. He debated honesty for approximately 2 seconds. "I'm thinking about what I'm going to do," he said. "About what?" "About all of it," he said. "About going back to San Antonio and giving Fitch his money and riding on to the next collection." She was quiet for a moment. The creek moved over its pale rocks. An owl called somewhere in the darkness of the trees. "You don't want to do that," she said. It was not a question. "No," he said, "I don't." Then what do you want? He looked at the fire for a moment and then back at her, and said the thing he had been thinking around for days without being able to say it directly. I want to stay, he said, in Hallow Creek. I don't know what that looks like, or whether it makes any sense, or whether it's what you want, but I want to stop moving. I've been moving for a long time. Mabel was quiet for a long time, not an uncomfortable silence, not a dismissive one, a thinking silence, the kind she gave to things she took seriously. The farm needs help, she said finally, real help. I've been managing alone for 8 months, and the cotton needs more than I can do by myself, and the cattle need someone to build up the herd. I've been putting it off because I couldn't afford to pay anyone. I'm not asking to be hired, he said. I know you're not, she said, but I'm telling you there's something worth having here if you're looking for a place. The farm is worth building. I believe that. She looked at him steadily. And I don't entirely dislike your company, which for me is more than it might sound like. I know it is, he said. You'd have to ride back to San Antonio, she said. Settle things with Fitch properly, give notice. I know. And you'd need somewhere to stay that's appropriate. Percy's saloon has rooms above it. Mrs. Hatcher in town rents a room. I know. She looked at him with those dark eyes that saw more than they let on. And you'd have to understand that I'm not promising you anything, she said. Except that I'd like to know you better, which is more than I've said to anyone in a long while. That's enough, he said. That's more than enough. She nodded once, decisively, the way she made most decisions, and turned back to the fire. And after a while she began to tell him about the cotton planting schedule and what the summer would need. And he listened, and the owl called again. And the creek moved over its pale rocks, and the fire burned low and comfortable between them. And it was, Cyrus thought, the best evening he had spent in longer than he could remember. When they returned to Hallow Creek, the letter from Colt Watkins in Abilene had already arrived, forwarded from Comanche Springs, where Mabel had directed it. Watkins agreed to the timber rights at the stated price of $100, with terms largely as Mabel had proposed. The total she had assembled between the commission, the cattle sale, her savings, and the timber rights sale came to $276, $6 more than the debt required. Cyrus drafted the payment agreement himself and sent the money to Fitch by bank draft from the Hallow Creek branch of the First County Bank, which had only recently opened, and whose manager looked nervous about large transactions in the way of people who had not been in the business long. The draft was certified and the agreement signed and witnessed by the bank manager, and when it was done, Mabel stood outside the bank in the afternoon sun and exhaled a breath that sounded like she had been holding it for 8 months. "It's done," Cyrus said. "It's done," she agreed. She turned to him, and for the first time in all the days he had known her, she looked like something had been lifted from her, some weight she had carried so long she had stopped noticing it until it was gone. She looked lighter. She looked, he thought, the way she was probably supposed to look, without the debt and the fear and the endless calculating necessity. She was beautiful in the particular way that people who are good at something are beautiful when you see them at rest from it. "Thank you," she said. "I could not have done this without you." "You'd have found another way," he said. "Maybe," she said, "but not this way, not in time." She offered her hand formally, which made him smile. He took it and held it for a moment before shaking it, and her hand was warm and calloused and real, and he held it perhaps a half-second longer than the formality required, and she did not pull it away. He rode to San Antonio the following week. Gerald Fitch received him in his office, which was furnished with the heavy, expensive confidence of a man who liked to remind people of the distance between them. Fitch was a compact, precise man of 50 with silver hair and the kind of watch chain that told you everything about what he valued. He counted the bank draft twice and signed the release and made a remark about Cyrus being slower than usual, to which Cyrus said nothing. "I'm giving notice," Cyrus said, when the paperwork was done. Fitch looked up from his desk. "Is that right?" "I'm staying in Hallow Creek," Cyrus said. "I appreciate the work. It's time to do something else." Fitch regarded him for a moment with the particular expression of a man whose money has just demonstrated that it does not solve everything. "There's good money in this work," he said. "There is," Cyrus agreed, "but I don't like what it does. I should have said so sooner." He rode back to Hallow Creek with a lighter feeling in his chest and a heavier feeling in his saddlebags, which contained everything he owned, and an uncertainty about what exactly he was riding toward that did not frighten him the way it once might have, because he was riding toward something specific, and that made all the difference. He rented a room from Mrs. Hatcher, who was a talkative widow of 60 who served breakfast at 6 and did not tolerate mud on her floors. He agreed to her terms and paid for a month in advance. He introduced himself around Hallow Creek as a man looking for ranch work, which was true in the broadest sense, and within 2 weeks had arrangements to help with fence repair on 3 neighboring properties in exchange for cash wages, and a standing offer from Jim Alders, who had heard about his conduct on the Comanche Springs trip and liked him for it, to help with spring branding. He went to the Bristol farm twice in that first week, once to help with a fence that had come down in a windstorm, and once because Mabel had sent a message via Percy that she could use another pair of hands with the cotton planting. He worked alongside her in the field for most of a long Tuesday, and they worked well together, each finding the rhythm of the other's effort without having to discuss it, the way people work who are paying attention. In the evenings he would sometimes sit on the porch of Mrs. Hatcher's house with a cup of coffee and think about how completely his life had altered in the span of 3 weeks and feel something about it that he could not name, something that was not quite happiness and not quite peace, but contained elements of both, the way a river contains elements of all the water that has fed into it. He knew that he had come to Hallow Creek as an instrument of someone else's interests and had ended up becoming something that served his own, and he was not sure that was entirely comfortable or entirely wrong, but it was entirely true. Mabel rode into town on a Saturday morning in early May, which was not unusual, but instead of going to the general store first as she normally did, she tied her horse outside Mrs. Hatcher's boarding house and knocked. Mrs. Hatcher answered with the look of a woman whose day has suddenly become more interesting and called Cyrus down from upstairs. He came down in his work shirt, sleeves rolled up, hat in hand, and found Mabel standing in Mrs. Hatcher's hallway with her own hat in hand, and something on her face that he had not seen there before, which was nervousness. It suited her the way it suits strong people when they allow it to show, making them more human without making them smaller. "Will you walk with me?" she said. They walked to the spring at the south end of town where the cottonwood trees made their shade and the water ran clear over the limestone. It was a Saturday and the town was busy behind them, the sound of it carrying on the spring air, but down by the spring it was quieter with the particular piece of running water. "I've been thinking," Mabel said, looking at the water. "I know," Cyrus said. She glanced at him. "What do you mean, you know?" "I mean you've been thinking since before I left for San Antonio and probably since before that," he said. "You think the way other people breathe, constantly and without stopping." She looked at him for a moment and then laughed, a real laugh, unself-conscious and warm, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. "I want you to help me build the farm," she said when the laughter had settled. "Not as a hired hand, as a partner, real partnership, in the farm and in the work and in whatever comes from both." He understood what she was saying. He was sure he understood it. He wanted to be sure. "Are you asking me to court you?" he said. "I'm asking you to mean it," she said. "I'm not interested in courtship for its own sake or in social expectations. I'm interested in whether you want to be here, truly here, not passing through." "I'm not passing through," he said. "I haven't been passing through since I rode back from San Antonio." She looked at him, searching for something, and seemed to find it. "Good," she said. "Then yes, I suppose I am asking you to court me, in the most practical and genuine sense of the phrase." He reached out and took her hand, the same hand he had held for a half-second too long outside the bank, and this time he held it without the pretense of a handshake, just held it in both of his own, and she looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and the nervousness had become something else, something warmer and less cautious. "I've been in your debt since before I met you," he said. "And I still don't know the full amount." She tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" He thought about how to say it and then decided to say it plainly because she was a woman who valued plainness above decoration. "I came here to collect what you owed, but I've been owing you something since the first day I sat in your kitchen, something I couldn't name for a while. And now," she said softly. "Now I think I can name it," he said. "Tell me," she said. "It's the debt you owe to the person who shows you what your life is supposed to feel like," he said. "I've owed you that since you made me coffee and didn't cry, and told me your plan with the same calm you'd use to discuss the weather. And I've been figuring out how to pay it back." She was quiet for a long moment, and the spring ran over its limestone and the cottonwood leaves turned in the light breeze above them. "You can't pay it back," she said finally. "That's not how it works." "I know," he said. "But you can build something instead," she said. "Something that makes the debt worthwhile." "That's what I intend," he said. She squeezed his hand once, firmly, decisively, in the way that was entirely her, and they stood together by the spring until the afternoon began to lengthen, and the town's Saturday sounds faded into the peaceable noise of a settling day. The summer of 1882 in Hallow Creek was hot in the way that West Texas summers are hot, the kind of heat that has a weight to it, that sits on the shoulders and asks something of you. Cyrus discovered that farming cotton in that heat was a different order of work from anything he had done, requiring a different kind of patience, a daily sustained attention rather than the concentrated bursts of effort he was more practiced in. He was good at it. He discovered this somewhat to his own surprise, and Mabel confirmed it without flattery, pointing out what he did well in the same direct way she pointed out what needed improvement, and both felt like things worth having. They worked the farm together through the heat of June and July, building the cotton rows up and managing the cattle and repairing things that needed repairing and occasionally sitting on the porch in the evening with cold water or coffee, depending on the hour, and talking the way people talk when they have spent all day in the same work and are still not done saying what they want to say to each other. Cyrus courted her with the kind of quiet consistency that was natural to him, not with grand gestures but with small true ones. He fixed the pump behind the farmhouse that had been sticking since Thomas Bristol's last winter. He brought her a book from the general store, a collection of poems by Walt Whitman, because she had mentioned once that her mother had read poetry to her and that she missed it. He braided a new set of reins for her horse, using the pattern he had learned from a vaquero on a cattle drive in Oklahoma, and she admired them with the honest appreciation she gave to things done with skill. She, in turn, showed him the farm in the way of a person who loves a place, pointing out its particular qualities with a pride that was not boastful but intimate. The way the cotton looked in the late afternoon light when the bolls were beginning to form. The spring in the back pasture that ran cold even in August. The view from the rise at the east edge of the property, where the land opened up, and you could see 20 miles on a clear day. She kissed him for the first time on that rise, on an August evening, unprompted and without announcement, and it was the kind of kiss that told him everything he needed to know about her, which was that she had thought it through beforehand and made a decision, and was now acting on it with the full weight of who she was. He kissed her back with everything he had, which turned out to be more than he'd known. When they separated, she looked at him with those dark eyes and said, "I've been meaning to do that for a while." "I'm glad you did," he said. "Are you?" she said. "Very much," he said, and kissed her again, and the view across the Texas plain dissolved behind them because there were better things to look at. The cotton that year, when it came in during the last week of August and the first week of September, was the best Mabel had seen in 3 years. Between his labor and her knowledge, they had managed the crop well, and the yield was strong enough that the proceeds paid off the remaining note on the farm's property taxes, covered the seed purchase for the following year, bought 2 more cattle, and a good young bull to strengthen the herd, and left a reserve that Mabel had not had since before her father died. She told him the final numbers one evening in September over supper, reading from the ledger she kept with the precision of a woman who had learned that numbers were not abstract, and he watched her face as she read, the satisfaction in it, the quiet pride. "We did well," he said. "We did," she agreed. She closed the ledger. "Cyrus, yes. I want to ask you something and I want you to answer me honestly." "Always," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to stay?" "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "That's not what I asked," she said. "Are you going to stay here, permanently? Is this your life now?" He understood what she was asking and what it would mean if his answer was yes. He had been without permanence for so long that the idea of it had a quality of strangeness, like trying on a coat you've never owned but that fits exactly right. "Yes," he said, "this is my life now if you'll have me." She looked at him for a long moment. "Is that a proposal?" "It is," he said. "A plain one. Without particular ceremony, but genuine." She was quiet for perhaps 5 seconds, which was 4 seconds longer than she needed, he suspected, because she had already been thinking about this answer for some time. "Yes," she said, "it is." They were married in November of 1882 in the Hallow Creek church by a minister who had come through from the county seat and who conducted the ceremony with a practical warmth that suited them both. The ceremony was small, attended by Percy and his wife from the saloon, Jim Alders and his wife, Mrs. Hatcher, who cried though she claimed it was allergies, and a handful of neighbors who had come to know Cyrus over the preceding months as a man who could be relied upon, which was the only reputation he had wanted. Mabel wore a dress she had made herself from calico fabric the color of cream, with small embroidered details at the collar and cuffs that she worked on in the evenings for 3 weeks. She wore her hair up with 2 tortoiseshell combs that had been her mother's. She did not carry flowers because it was November and the flowers were done, but she carried herself with the particular dignity of a person who is doing exactly what they want to be doing. Cyrus stood at the front of the church in his best shirt and his least worn pair of trousers, and a jacket he had bought from the dry goods store in Comanche Springs on a trip made for exactly this purpose, and watched her walk toward him down the short aisle, and felt something so large and so complete that it had no edges. He had spent years moving through a life that fit him the way a borrowed coat fits, serviceable but not quite right. He had not known what he was looking for, partly because looking required a belief that the thing existed, and he had not entirely believed that. He believed it now. When the minister said the words that concluded the ceremony, Cyrus took both her hands in his and held them and looked at her, and she looked back at him with those dark eyes that had been clear and direct from the first moment. He had seen her across a field with a hammer in her hand, and something settled in him that had been unsettled for 31 years. "I am very glad," he said to her quietly, when the minister had finished and before the assembled guests began their congratulations, "that Fitch sent me here." She laughed, that real warm laugh, and leaned up and kissed him in front of God and Percy and Mrs. Hatcher and everyone, and he kissed her back because she was his wife, and it was November in Hallow Creek and the cotton was in, and the debt was paid and he was not going anywhere. The following years on the Bristol farm, which Mabel and Cyrus came to simply call the Brenner place, though Mabel kept the Bristol name on the deed in honor of her father, were years of building. They built in the literal sense, adding a room to the farmhouse in the spring of 1883, replacing the old frame structure with proper timber brought up from Sanderson. They built the cattle herd steadily, the young bull proving a good investment, and by 1884 they were running 40 head of Longhorn and had sold their first significant herd to a buyer from Abilene. They built the farm's reputation in the county as well, Mabel's practical knowledge and Cyrus's physical capacity, and his willingness to work across the fence with neighbors, creating the kind of goodwill that turns a struggling property into an established one. Jim Alders, whose eyesight continued to fail, sold them his east pasture at a fair price in 1883, adding 15 acres that gave them room for the expanded herd. In June of 1883, Mabel told him over breakfast, with the same direct practicality she brought to all significant information, that she was expecting a child. She told him while he was drinking his coffee and looking at the morning light on the cotton field through the window, and he set down his cup and looked at her and felt that same large, edgeless feeling that had no name. "Are you happy about it?" she asked. "Mabel," he said, "there are not words adequate to what I am about this." She smiled, wide and genuine, and reached across the table and squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back. Their son was born in January of 1884 in the farmhouse, delivered by Mrs. Almira Potts, who served as the region's midwife, and who arrived in the middle of a cold night, and left in the early morning, having done an exceptional job. Mabel labored with the same formidable endurance she brought to everything, and Cyrus sat outside the bedroom door for most of 4 hours telling himself various things that did not help and making coffee that he did not drink. When Mrs. Potts came out and told him he could go in, he went in and found Mabel propped against the pillows looking exhausted and extraordinary, and in her arms was a small, red-faced person wrapped in the blanket she had made for this purpose over the preceding months. He sat on the edge of the bed, and she put the baby into his arms with the confidence of someone who knows the other person will not drop what matters. The baby opened his eyes, dark like his mother's, and looked at Cyrus with the profound and somewhat accusatory stare of the newborn, as if uncertain why this particular face was the first thing he was choosing to see. "Hello," Cyrus said, quietly, because it seemed like a moment that required words and he could not find better ones. "We should name him," Mabel said. "Thomas," Cyrus said immediately, for her father, because it was right. Mabel pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." Thomas Brenner grew up on the farm the way children grow up when they have land and parents who both know something real and want to share it. He was a curious, vigorous child who walked early and talked constantly, and who demonstrated by the age of 3 that he had his mother's directness and his father's stubbornness, which Mabel said was going to be an interesting combination, and which Cyrus said was probably going to give them both gray hair. In 1886, they had a second child, a girl they named Eleanor, after Cyrus's mother who had died some years earlier. Eleanor arrived in the summer, easier than Thomas, and she was from the beginning a different kind of person than her brother, quieter and more observant, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's mouth. Life on the Brenner farm in those years had the quality of something made on purpose, with intention and attention, the way good things are made. There were hard years and there were good years and there were ordinary years that were neither. And through all of them, the fundamental thing did not change, which was that Cyrus Brenner was exactly where he had decided to be, and had not once in all the time since November of 1882 been uncertain about that decision. He had, occasionally, in the quiet of an evening when Mabel was reading and the children were asleep, and the farm was settled around them in its particular night sounds, tried to think about what his life would have been if he had ridden out of Hallow Creek that first week with a lien notice in his pocket. He could not quite make himself imagine it, which he thought said something important, though he was not sure he could articulate what. He was not a man given to deep philosophical examinations of things. But he knew what it felt like to belong somewhere, because he had spent most of his life before not belonging anywhere, and the difference was as clear as the difference between drought and water. One evening in the summer of 1887, when Thomas was 3 and Eleanor was 1, and the cotton was in its best form in 5 years, and the cattle herd was doing well, and the mortgage on the additional land was nearly paid, Mabel and Cyrus sat on the porch of the farmhouse in the warm evening air, listening to the farm settle around them. She had a book in her lap but was not reading it. He had a cup of coffee going cold on the rail beside him. The sky to the west was doing its extraordinary thing, going from gold to copper to a deep indefinite purple that was almost blue. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the sky. "Which part?" he asked. "Staying," she said, "giving up the other life, such as it was." He thought about it honestly, which was the only way she had ever wanted him to think about things. He thought about the roads he had ridden, and the towns he had moved through, and the work he had done that sat badly in him afterward. He thought about Drum, now old and fat and living in comfortable retirement in the back pasture because Cyrus could not bring himself to sell him, who had once covered the distance between here and San Antonio in a week, and who now moved between the gate and the water trough at a pace that expressed his feelings about effort. "No," he said, "not even close." "Good," she said, and picked up her book. He looked at her for a moment, the way he still looked at her after 5 years of marriage, with the particular quality of attention that had not diminished and that he had given up trying to explain to himself, because some things were not improved by explanation. "Mabel," he said. "I came here to collect a debt," he said. She lowered the book and looked at him with the expression she used when he said things she was deciding whether to take seriously. "I remember," she said. "I came back owing one I could not name," he said. She was quiet for a moment. The sky deepened. Somewhere in the back pasture Drum made the sound he made, low and companionable. "And now," she said. "Now I can name it," he said. "I've been naming it every day for 5 years." She looked at him, and in her eyes was something he had seen build there over those years, accumulated from all the evenings and all the work and all the laughter and all the small true things, the way a river accumulates from 1,000 small sources. "Tell me," she said. "My life," he said simply. "I owe you my life, not because you gave it to me but because I didn't have one until I found you." She set the book on the rail. She crossed the porch to where he sat and stood in front of him, and he looked up at her, and she put her hands on either side of his face, the way she sometimes did when she wanted his full attention, though she had always had his full attention. "You are the best surprise I ever had," she said quietly. "You came to my door with bad news and became the best thing in my life. I want you to know that I know that I know it clearly and without reservation." "I know you do," he said. "That's the other thing I owe you." "What is?" "Knowing that someone sees me clearly and chooses me anyway," he said. "That's not a small thing." "No," she said, "it is not." She leaned down and kissed him, the way she had kissed him 100 times and the way that had never become ordinary, and the West Texas evening settled around them with its vast indifferent beauty. And inside the house, Thomas turned in his sleep and Alina made the small sound she made, and the farm was quiet and real around them, built from the ground up from one unpayable debt and the willingness to stay. The years that followed were not without their difficulties. 1888 brought a dry summer that hit the cotton hard, and they spent long hours rationing the water from the spring and making difficult choices about the herd. Cyrus sold 8 head at a loss, and they tightened the household budget to nothing unnecessary, eating from the kitchen garden and the root cellar and making do. It was a lean year but not a breaking one, and by 1889 the rains came back and the cotton with them. Thomas at 5 was already following his father around the farm with the dedicated seriousness of someone who intends to understand everything. He asked questions in the relentless way of children who genuinely want the answers, and Cyrus answered every single one, about cattle and cotton and fence post physics and how to read weather from cloud formation, and about why the spring never ran dry even in summer, which had to do with the limestone aquifer, which led to a 40-minute discussion about where water comes from and where it goes, which Thomas found deeply satisfying and Mabel found entertaining to overhear. Alina at 3 was already showing a particular gift for animals. The farm dog, a border collie mix named Cinder they had gotten as a pup in 1886, followed Alina with the absolute devotion that some dogs reserve for one particular person, and Alina could calm the most fractious of the cattle with a steadiness of presence that Cyrus watched with something close to awe. In 1890, Mabel told him over breakfast again, with the same directness as before, that she believed they were expecting again. He set down his coffee cup and looked at her, and she was already smiling, because she knew what he was going to do before he did it, which was to stand up and pull her to her feet, and hold her in the middle of the kitchen for a long, quiet moment with the morning light coming through the flour sack curtains that had long since been replaced with proper calico, but which she sometimes missed. "A full house," he said into her hair. "A full life," she corrected, which was her version of the same sentiment and the better one. Their second son was born in the autumn of 1890, healthy and loud, named Daniel after no one in particular, but because they both liked the name. He arrived with a head of red hair that puzzled everyone, including Mabel, until she remembered that her maternal grandmother had been described as a redhead, which resolved the mystery and delighted her. The Brenner farm by the early 1890s was a going concern by any measure the county could apply. They were running 60 head of cattle, cultivating 15 acres of cotton and 3 of kitchen garden, keeping chickens, and had expanded the farmhouse twice, so that it was now a proper 6-room structure with a real parlor and a sleeping room for each of the children. Cyrus had built a proper barn to replace the old shelter, and the fencing around the property was the best kept in the district. More than the material facts, the farm had the quality of a place that was loved. You could see it in the way things were maintained, not perfectly. Farms are never perfect, but with care. You could see it in the garden Mabel kept at the south side of the house, which grew vegetables and also sunflowers because she liked sunflowers, and which she tended in the evenings with the same focus she gave to the ledger and the planting schedule. You could see it in the way the children were on the land, easy and unself-conscious, the way children are on land that has always been home. In 1892, Jim Alders died peacefully at 73 and left his remaining 40 acres to Mabel and Cyrus by name in his will, saying in the document that he could not think of better hands to put it in. It was an act of generosity that surprised them both and moved them in the way that unexpected goodness from good people always moves you. They incorporated the Alders land into the farm gradually, using it to expand the cattle range and planting the eastern portion with a second cotton crop that they sharecropped with a family named Rays who had come up from South Texas looking for land and had found nothing affordable except the offer Cyrus made them, which was fair by any standard and somewhat better. The Rays family, Emilio and Maria and their 4 children, became the nearest thing to neighbors they had, living in the old Alders house across the fence and working their portion of the land with the focused dedication of people who have found something worth having after looking for it a long time. Cyrus recognized that in them, and it was part of why the arrangement worked as well as it did. There was an evening in the summer of 1893 when Cyrus and Emilio were sitting on the fence rail of the back pasture after a long day's branding, watching the cattle settle in the late light, and Emilio said something that stayed with Cyrus afterward. He said that he had been afraid when he first came to the county looking for work that there would be no place for him and his family, that the doors would be closed. And, Cyrus said, and most of them were, Emilio said without bitterness, which took more grace than most, but not all. Cyrus thought about Gerald Fitch's office in San Antonio, and about the doors that had been closed to Mabel, and about what happens when the only door left open is not a very good one and you have to walk through it anyway. I know something about that, he said. I know you do, Emilio said. Mabel told Maria the story of how you came here, the whole story. Did she? Cyrus said. She said you came to take something from her and ended up giving her more than she could have managed alone. He looked at the cattle. That is a rare thing. She did it herself, Cyrus said. I just stayed. Staying, Emilio said, is the whole of it. Most people leave. The children grew up alongside each other. Thomas and Eleanor and Daniel Brenner alongside the Rays children. And it was a good growing up, full of the particular freedom of children who have land and summer, and the reliable presence of adults who take them seriously. Thomas, by 12, was already talking about whether he would farm or whether he would study, a conversation that Mabel entertained with full seriousness, telling him he could do either and that she would be proud in both cases, and that the most important thing was whether the thing he chose was something he meant. Eleanor at 10 had the same steadiness her mother had, the same directness, and a way with animals that was becoming something she thought about practically, asking Cyrus questions about the cattle health and the veterinary principles she had read about in the almanac. Daniel at 3 was large and cheerful and red-haired, and moved through the world like someone who has decided in advance that everything in it is interesting, which made him both a delight and a constant supervisory challenge. On a September evening in 1893, the cotton long since brought in and the accounts balanced and the farm in its autumn quiet, Mabel and Cyrus sat on the porch as they did most evenings, and the sky was doing its thing again and the children were inside, and Cinder the dog was asleep on the step. 11 years, Mabel said. Since I rode up to your gate, he said, more or less. You look tired, she said. I was tired, he said. I'd been tired for years and didn't know it. You looked like someone who had stopped expecting anything, she said. He considered this. I had, he said. Is that terrible? No, she said. It's human. It's what happens when things don't go the way you hoped for long enough. She looked at the sky. What I didn't expect was that you would be the one to come, of all the people Fitch could have sent. He picked me because I was reliable, Cyrus said. He meant it as a professional quality. And it was, Mabel said. It still is. You are the most reliable person I have ever known. He looked at her. She was 41, and the years of sun and work had given her face a quality that was not about youth or its absence, but about character, a face that had done something real and showed it. You're the reason I became that, he said. Or you're the reason I had something worth being reliable for. That's the debt again, she said with a slight smile. The debt again, he agreed. Some debts you carry not because you owe them, but because they're worth carrying. She reached over and took his hand, the same hand she had taken a dozen years ago by the spring in Hallow Creek. He held it the way he always held it, as if it were something real and permanent, which it was. The night came down over the farm in the gradual way of autumn nights, taking its time, generous with the last of the day. The cattle moved in the back pasture. The cotton was done and the earth rested. In the house behind them, Thomas laughed at something, and then Daniel laughed at whatever Thomas had laughed at, and Eleanor told them both to be quiet, which made them laugh more. Cyrus Brenner sat on the porch of the farm that had been the Bristol farm, and was now the Brenner farm and would one day be the Thomas Brenner farm or the Eleanor Brenner farm or the Daniel Brenner farm or all three of them together, and held his wife's hand, and thought about the road from San Antonio, and about a gate and a woman with a hammer and a cup of coffee and a plan. He had come to collect a debt. He had come back owing something he could not name. He had learned the name in the 12 years. He had been learning it every day, in the field and in the kitchen, and in the bed at night with her hair against his shoulder, in the particular sound of her laughter, and in the way she moved through the world, upright and clear-eyed and entirely herself. The name of what he owed her was everything. And he spent the rest of his life paying it gladly, in the small true currency of staying and showing up and being present, in the work and the evenings and the children and the cotton fields and the cattle and the spring that never dried up even in August, in the particular way she looked at him across a room sometimes that said she knew him completely and was not going anywhere. He paid it every day, and it was, without question, the best debt he had ever carried.